Welcome to Discovering. Tonight we take a tour of the Nonesuch mine in the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park.
You're going to be seeing buildings and structures and rocks and all these cool ruins all throughout hidden in the woods.
And we learn about a bat movie being filmed right here in the UP. So sit back and relax. It's Monday night and it's time for Discovering.
The secret streams that flow beneath the cliffs of colored stone. Forest thick and healthy with birch and pine and oak. Surrounded by the greatest lakes this world has ever known. The black bear's awesome presence as he roams the hills and fields. Call of the timber wolf, the loon's lonesome trill. The eagle soaring high above, the trout lies deep and still. These are what I treasure, the only way I measure feelings that I have for this fine land. There is so much to discover when you're a long-time lover of northern Michigan.
Spring is finally here in the UP. That means the roads around the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park should be clear of snow by now, and hikers are gearing up to hit the trails. There are 90 miles of hiking trails in the Porkies. Some take you to beautiful overlooks of the wilderness, some to remote lakes and old-growth stands, some to the rivers that cut through the 60,000 acres of forests, some to the many waterfalls, and some to the old copper mining sites. There are 45 copper mine sites scattered across the Porcupine Mountains. The most unique is the Nonesuch mine site, located in the southeast corner of the park, just off the south boundary road. There is one sign at the trailhead that tells you some of the history of Nonesuch. Once you get to the site, though, there are no signs to tell you what all the ruins are that you see. So I met up with park interpreter Katie Urban to learn more about the history of the Nonesuch and what you see today.
So my name is Katie Urban. I'm the interpreter here at the Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park. And today we're going to be going on the tour of the Nonesuch area. But the first thing I always want to talk about on these tours is kind of what is the Nonesuch, right? So the word Nonesuch, what does it mean? Nothing quite such as it is kind of what it comes down to. And now we're thinking, well, there's nothing quite like it, right? Well, maybe that's bad, maybe that's good, but back in the day when the title was given to it, they thought when they first discovered this mining area that this was like the granddaddy of all mines because it was going to be so great and there's nothing quite like it. So there's nothing that compared to it. But they found out quite too soon that, well, there's nothing quite that compares to it, but it's not quite in the good way. So we'll figure out why here in a little bit. So one of the first things you're going to start seeing as you're coming from the parking lot, heading down towards the waterfall, you're going to be seeing these kind of weird open pockets of spots of land. And maybe in other places that's kind of common. But here at the Porcupine Mountains, we're a wilderness park. We're full of thick forests and rivers and streams and mountains. And these open spots that you see here and there aren't something you would normally see. Start looking around for more clues and you'll notice behind the pretty trees, we have another tree that's growing. A sign from before that people used to live here, right? They brought this tree here, they planted it here. So you can have to imagine right here used to be a house. All along this nice trail we're walking on was a road. And as you come down these sites, you have to imagine people living here at one time, right? In the 1800s. Basically what we walked down here was the road with the houses on either side. We just came down here. And as we made the turn here, we're in this area here where the kind of the bigger part of the community was at. We have the schoolhouse, we have the different buildings from the different stores, different things like that.
This community built around the mine is one of the things that make the Nonesuch unique. It was the only copper mine in the Porkies with a village. In its heyday, over 100 people lived and worked in Nonesuch. They even had a baseball team, and a weekly stagecoach ran from Ontonagon to Nonesuch.
The start of this whole area, we had a gentleman. He was walking around, and as he was walking along, he found at a base of a waterfall, which you can hear right now, all the way down the trail here, he found at the base of a waterfall a nice chunk of copper, right? He ran back to town and said, I found a spot, I've got it, and a couple of gentlemen found out that he found a good spot and traded him for his information, right? They said that was probably the only time the Nonesuch mine was actually had some form of good profit. So it was a group of gentlemen from Ontonagon that said, let's band together, let's pool our money, and let's start this mine. So they came in and they put in 2 shafts, so 2 mine shafts in the area. They dug down and started pulling out all that copper ore. And they made just a very small, tiny water-powered mill. Now, as you're walking through this site, you're gonna be seeing buildings and structures and rocks and all these cool ruins all throughout hidden in the woods. This is something that's taken years and years to build. So this is an effect of multiple companies. So not one company came in and built all of these things, and that's what you're seeing today. We don't know exactly what was from what people, but we do know the general function of each building and each structure.
The first Nonesuch mining company was formed in 1867. Over the span of 48 years, a total of 5 companies would construct and operate mills at this site. Only 20 years were operational, and copper production was limited to only 11 years. And for only a very brief period did the mine ever see a profit. Those were the years when the mine was under the supervision of Captain Thomas Hooper, a man who played a key role in developing other successful copper mines in the area.
So the mines were off over to this side here, and you could hear the waterfall coming from this way, and they would pull the rocks out, and he used this whole shape of this hill and the gravity of the hill to actually move the product down towards the water. So as it would be hoisted up here, and the hoist house is above here, the rock was put in through this area off to this side of the trail, stashed here, and then the rock would be processed as it moved down the hill. And then the first structure you see as you're coming down the hill is this huge rock wall, and that is our boiler house. So this is where a lot of the steam engines were at that were powering a lot of the things going around in the different spots of the mine here. So his mining setup went a little bit like this. He brought that rock, hand sorted it over in the shafts, shipped it all the way up, and put it on the very top of this hill here. And then once that boiler house, he had 2 big steam boilers in here that were running the mills over here. They had gravity stamps at this point, so they would raise them up and then they'd drop these giant heads down, trying to separate the copper rock from the copper pieces itself, right? So the rock and the pieces that the copper was in, break it apart, because they wanted that most pure copper, because that's how they're gonna make the most money. So you can see all along the ground here, because these machines, as they're raising up these giant pieces and dropping them, they had to bolt them to the ground. This is kind of where the milling area happened for all the companies that did milling. Let's go a little bit further down the hill and take a look here. So after the rock was crushed to pieces, the next spot would be for people to wash the rock. Kind of like the miners, right, as they sift through the rocks, kind of all the way out in the west. People were mining for gold, right, and they were sifting for gold. So they were washing the rock. That's kind of what Thomas Hooper did, but he did it on a bigger scale here. Now the next step would be using the steepest part of the hill here. He had these conveyor belts slanted down, and he would have water running down the conveyor belt. And what it would do is it would wash and pick up all the sand and the rocks and the pieces like that. And copper was heavy, right? Metals are heavy. And copper would sit on the conveyor belt and push it down, and it would result in the copper being collected and the rock and the water being washed to a different spot. And then the last thing he did is he built a tram line, and he would use that tram line and he'd run those rail carts all the way to Union Bay, and then he would ship them out on the boats down to sometimes the Detroit area to be smelted to get the purest form of copper and make his profit. He didn't make a lot of money, but he did make money.
What else that made the Nonesuch unique was the type of copper found here. The pure native copper wasn't in large masses like you found elsewhere in the Keweenaw. It was in the form of very thin flakes and grains that was scattered throughout the sandstone rock, which proved to be nearly impossible to extract with the stamping processes available at the time. The third company to attempt mining found a new process of extracting the copper from the ore that was invented by a man in Chicago named Jenks, and built one of the most elaborate plants in the country right here.
So let's go through his process, because you will find some of the pieces of that process here today. So let's go ahead and take a look. Now, everybody that comes down here thinks this is gotta be one of the mine shafts, right? But if you peek in there, it's a huge oven. They built this rocks all the way around to be an oven that concentrates the heat and comes out. And they had a big drum or barrel that they had mounted out here. And they rolled the rock around in here, and it was heated up in this oven. And the idea was that the copper and the rock that was holding it heat up at different temperatures and expand at different temperatures. And heating it up would break it up even more. So when it came out of this area, it can be ready for the next process, part of that process that Jenks, the chemist, came up with from Chicago. So the rock was sent back up the hill, and it went down into these chemical tanks, and they used all these different chemicals to kind of dissolve everything. Now they called this stuff, as they dissolved the nice fine copper rock powder, they called it a slime. And then directly across from that, you'll start seeing all these weird little holes in the ground. And these were called precipitating barrels. Picture these giant wooden barrels. The metal rings and the bands that used to hold the barrels together, they're still here. There's kind of pieces here and there. And what they would do is they would take that slime and they would take a piece of iron and they would drop it down there. And what would happen is that the iron would allow the copper to stick to it. And 100% pure copper will be stuck to that iron, and they could scrape it off, and it worked great, but only in Jenks' lab. When it came out here, they spent $400,000 to build this huge area, and he could never get it to work here in this spot. And it completely made this entire mine area shut down, all because that chemical process that this whole company was built around failed.
In 1887, the mine was dismantled and the machinery was shipped to various other mines across the UP. In later years, 2 more companies tried to mine this spot and gave up.
So one of the last rock structures that are left behind is going to be something left over from the hoist house. But it did house a lot of other purposes too. This is also the same area where the blacksmiths would be set up, where the carpenters would be set up. So very cool structure. Just be careful and be aware of all the pieces that may be falling and crumbling off, and be safe while you're exploring these spots. So as you come out and explore this area here, the Nonesuch area, and try and figure out little pieces of the story yourself, if you find something cool on the ground, that's awesome, and we're glad you did. But don't move them, don't take them, leave them where they are. Just like this piece here, being held down by the tree, this has something to do with this area. We might not know what it is yet, but this could be an important piece to the puzzle. And if we're missing pieces, it's kind of hard to see the full picture sometimes.
To learn more about the history of the Nonesuch, I posted a link to the documentary on the 906 Outdoors Facebook page. By now, we've all heard about the devastating effects that white nose syndrome has had on our bat population here in the UP. I recently chatted with a filmmaker who is doing a bat movie about this.
My name is Kristen Tiash, and I'm the director of an upcoming feature documentary called The Invisible Mammal. And The Invisible Mammal is a film about bats in North America and the amazing women in science who are working to protect bats and save them from possible extinction. I knew the story that I wanted to tell was, what was going on with white nose syndrome. At this point, 2019, white nose syndrome was detected for the first time in California, really close to home for me. And I couldn't believe it, because for a decade, I've been watching the map where you see the detection of white nose syndrome slowly creep from just, in the northeastern part of the United States of America. Now it's in 37 states and 7 provinces. So I reached out to Bat Conservation International, and they are doing an incredible study that could change the game for little brown bats and all bats that are succumbing to the effects of white nose syndrome. They're doing a study that is centered around the abandoned copper mines in the Michigan Upper Peninsula. Little brown bats used to live in these abandoned copper mines, tens of thousands. And now, the populations have dwindled down to like hundreds or something, so there are remnant populations that live there. And their goal with the study is to help those remnant populations survive. So white nose syndrome is caused by a fungus. The fungus was brought in to the cave in upstate New York, originally, they think, by a human, somebody who tracked it into the cave. It was on their shoes or on their clothing. And then once you're inside a damp environment like a cave, the fungus will grow and then spread. And then the bats that hibernate inside the caves, then they get it. And so they call it white nose because there's a white fungus that forms around the bats' noses while they're hibernating. It causes them to wake up before hibernation is over. And then because that's the dead of winter, there's no bugs to eat. So the bats end up dying from starvation. That's why, millions and millions of bats have been wiped out by this disease. Back to the study that's happening at these mines. These scientists, they found out that if bats were fat enough, then even if they had white nose syndrome, they could last until the end of hibernation. So they found out that was something that they could help bats do. They could help bats get fatter. And this is how they do it. So they raise these light lures up into the trees around the entrance to these abandoned copper mines. Those light lures attract the bugs that the bats eat to the lights. And so then when the bats emerge from the mine at night to feed, they don't have to go too far. They just have to go right over to this light lure, and they're feasting on what the scientists are literally calling a bug buffet. So the bats, like when they go out to go find dinner at night, they don't have to go all the way across town to some restaurant, that's open. They can just go right across the street and there's an all-you-can-eat buffet of their favorite bugs, and then they can just save their little calories, and they don't have to burn them off by flying far to feed on bugs. They can just go right to this location that's right outside of their habitat. And then the bats are fat enough that they can go into hibernation and then wake up in the spring. And even if they have white nose syndrome, once spring comes around and the warm weather, comes back and the bats are flying, it goes away. It just dries up. So what they want to do with this fat bat study, it's literally called Operation Fat Bat. If it's successful in the Michigan Upper Peninsula, they want to replicate it anywhere that white nose poses a threat to bats in North America. And this is also the story that we're telling in The Invisible Mammal. So this is the major storyline. This is the big question that we're asking. Is this study, the fat bat study, is it working? Is it saving the bats up in Michigan Upper Peninsula? Are there survivors? Early fall of 2022, we're going to go back to Delaware Mine and probably Adventure Mine as well. And we are going to continue following the study. By that point, they should have some preliminary results. Actually, we're currently running a 30-day crowdfunding campaign that will end on May 11th to fund the rest of production this year. Anybody would like to make a pledge and help our campaign, we would just so appreciate that. And we've created a website for people to learn more about the project. And there's plenty of amazing incentives that people can take advantage of. tinyurl.com/iHeartBats.
I myself can't wait to see the completed film and if this study is successful in helping to save our bats.
The Delta County Gun Owners Association will be hosting the Escanaba Gun and Knife Show on May 6th and 7th at the Delta County Chamber of Commerce Center. Show hours are Friday noon to 6 and Saturday 9 to 3. Admission is $5 and children under 12 are free, so bring the kids. All proceeds go toward operation costs for the new facility. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next week right here on Upper Michigan's very own Discovering.